Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming up.
First, explain to us where we are and what we're doing here.
Well, we're here at the Sagamore, where coincidentally the Associated General Contractors of New York State, we're having our summer meeting. So we've
Not
got,
planned, by the way.
You know, timing is interesting. We've got about 200 folks here from around the state, and certainly we've been talking a lot the last couple of days about what's going on around the state with the infrastructure and what happened in Albany just this week.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, actually. I mean, it really inconvenienced 14,000 people who come in and out of the South Mall every day, of course. It was cracks that developed, actually, not the dropping of the highway, which was the last time we had this problem.
I remember that well. Yeah.
But the inconvenience factor is actually what people feel the most, but this is a problem that's much more serious than that.
There's no doubt. This was news this week, but it's not really news, because as you noted, it was 6 years ago that not far from there, a piece of the road structure actually fell.
Right.
And all around the state, this is happening. I know that you're going to be looking at some other areas where similar things have happened, and really what it is symptomatic of what happens when you've got year after year of underinvestment in our infrastructure, and as a result, our infrastructure is crumbling. It's not good for motorists, it's not good for safety, it's not good for the economy. It's very bad news.
The problem is that nobody thinks about it, right, because this stuff isn't sexy. What's sexy is gay marriage, what's sexy is taxes, et cetera, and if you don't actually have a dedicated fund, which we'll get into in a second, then you're not going to have the money to do the infrastructure maintenance, to do the kind of things that people don't see until it's too late.
Well, they think about it for a few days when things like this happen, and we've been talking to a lot of folks in the media. There's a lot of interest. I guarantee you by next week everybody will be talking about something else until something else happens, and it will happen because it's been happening for years. This is not a new problem.
I have actually given out some statistics at the top of the show, but just how bad is it from the standpoint of the Contractors Association?
Well, we have in New York State some of the worst bridge conditions in the country. We have some really poor road conditions around the state. Right now we have the smallest highway program that the state's had in about a decade. And the state of the infrastructure is very poor, so there's just not enough money to do the things that we need to do to maintain a state of good repair, much less make the sort of improvements and modernizations that we would want to. And that's very bad, because obviously in order for our economy to be healthy, for our economy to thrive, to recover, to come back, you need to have an infrastructure that works, and we don't right now in too many parts of the state.
How much money do you think, I mean, at best case scenario, how much money do you think there should be in that fund?
Well, it's very complicated, because a lot of the funding, there's state funding and there's federal funding, and there's sort of two things going on at once right now. You've got the state's dedicated fund, which we should talk about some more. It's in very, very bad shape, and it's not quite so dedicated, if you will. It's being used for a lot of things that have nothing to do.
We didn't even have it before 1991.
No.
I mean, the idea that it actually, in 1991 when it was created, we were one of 3 states that didn't have one. And then, of course, we had one, and everyone was very pleased about that, except that, as you say, the dedicated part of it isn't actually being
It's supposed to be a lockbox. When you fill up at the pump, you pay gas taxes, and part of that goes to the dedicated trust fund.
Right.
The problem is, as I said, it's not quite as dedicated as you might like it to be. You've got about $700 million a year in expenditures coming out of that fund for things like snow removal, bus inspections, DMV operations.
Well, but those things are important, obviously.
But they're not road and bridge maintenance, which is what that fund is meant to be for. So if it was intended as a lockbox, I think we need to go ahead and change the key, because too many people are reaching into that fund.
Yeah, but well, hold on, though. As a local guy, I mean, you've worked at the Pataki administration, obviously. You've been active in local politics. I mean, the local governments would say, yeah, but we have so much mandate, and you and I have talked about this, we have so much unfunded state mandates that we can't afford to do things like salt our own roads or whatever this money is going to help us do.
It's not necessarily even going to locals, though. It's other parts of state operations. It's really state operations that have been funded out of the trust fund, because the state has decided over the years that they see a pot of money. It's a very dangerous thing to be in Albany, so it gets used for other things. The other problem is, frankly, that the fund is insolvent right now. It's been very poorly managed, and what's really alarming about it is the single biggest expense to the fund annually is not road and bridge maintenance, it's debt service, and that went up $300 million last year alone. About a 30% increase last year alone, because how poorly it's been managed and all the bonding and debt that's been taken on, because there hasn't been sufficient resources.
You could do about that? I mean, could you actually refinance?
There's a lot of things you could do. The first thing to do, and we pushed legislation this year that Tom Libous supported in the Senate, that passed the Senate, will be to get all these other hands out of the fund, make it a dedicated fund, change the lock on the lockbox, and make sure that that money is going where it's supposed to go.
Right.
And also make sure that more of that gas tax revenue that comes in, not talking about increasing gas taxes in this economy, and certainly with gas prices being what they are, we have one of the highest gas taxes in the country, but talking about making sure that more of that revenue gets to the fund. So you start by trying to make sure that the money that's already out there for these things where there's so much need is getting where it should be and being used for what it's intended.
What about a bond act? Because that was something actually that in the Pataki administration we saw. It was actually for environmental projects.
No, there was a transportation bond act too.
Okay, so then why not actually go that route? Go to the voters who certainly understand and see the need. I mean, certainly in Crown Point they're seeing it, and say, hey, look, we need the money. Let's go.
It's certainly an option, and we've had conversations with the DOT. They're our partners. The commissioner was here with us this morning. They understand the need. They understand it probably better than anybody because they're out there. It was their inspection that uncovered this problem in Albany. A bond act is a possibility. We're talking to the Cuomo administration about this. They understand the need. They understand the importance of this in terms of having an infrastructure that supports an economy and economic recovery. There's a lot of options out there. One of the things that we've been talking about this week, the Marcellus Shale, everybody's talking about that.
Right.
That will create a lot of demand on the state's transportation infrastructure. It will require a lot of improvement to the infrastructure, but it's also going to, well, it's in a lot of very rural areas that have roads that weren't intended to have the volume and the kind of heavy truck traffic that you'd have if you have this activity. And that's going to mean an influx of a lot of money into the state. So one of the things that we're talking about is if you proceed with that, there ought to be some of that revenue that's pegged for infrastructure. It just makes sense, and it frankly may be a way for the state to get out of the hole that they're in with infrastructure funding.
Okay, so two things here. One would be something dedicated out of hydrofracking, if in fact the state goes forward with that. The other would be a bond act. What would be another way of getting more money in at a time when obviously the state doesn't have as much money as it would like to have?
Well, it's clear that there's not going to be a tax increase. No. The governor's made that very plain publicly, privately, and I think he's right about that. It may also be about looking at the revenues that are out there, making sure we get them, looking at new revenues like potentially from the gas drilling, but also frankly trying to look at ways to make the way we do this work more efficient, to get projects done more quickly. To get design building done more quickly, to look at public-private partnerships, particularly for some of the really big projects out there, like I know, you folks were down at the Tappan Zee. That's a huge project. And there could be opportunities to do things like that with a public-private partnership.
Yeah, but I mean, what about, for example, this is going probably a little bit even further, but like branding, someday are we going to see the Pepsi Tappan Zee Bridge?
Well,
privatization.
That would be, that's a lot of Pepsi. That's a very large volume of Pepsi from the Tappan Zee Bridge. But
yeah, I know. But just to explain, right, it's in the billions. It's a project in the billions. Sure. I understand that. But when you start talking about public-private partnerships, I think that's what people start thinking about is the privatization of state assets, which is not something that necessarily people want to see.
Well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And Senator Fuschillo, who now chairs the Transportation Committee, has a bill on this. He came and met with us about it, earlier this spring. And it's a conversation starter, really. We know the administration is interested in looking at public-private partnership. It's very new to New York for this type of work, and there's a lot of the ways that we do this sort of construction is sort of behind how other parts of the country do it. We have a lot of catching up to do here, a lot of streamlining to do, and public-private partnerships are not necessarily, the silver bullet here to solve this, but it is certainly something that may help us, particularly with some of these huge projects like Tappan Zee, which has been talked about, God, for over a decade.
Well over a decade, sure.
And, what's bad about this, whether it's the Tappan Zee or whether it's a local road, the longer you defer the repair, the maintenance that has to be done, the more expensive it gets. And so Commissioner McDonald said this morning, we can pay today, or we can pay a lot more tomorrow or down the road, and that's what we're dealing with.
Knowing what you know, when you drive around New York, do you specifically plot out your travel plan to avoid certain areas of the state?
Well, I have no sense of direction virtually, so it's hard for me to do that. I'm very reliant on GPS, but no, I don't. I mean, I have confidence in the professionals at DOT. They're our partners. They are very good at knowing what's going on with the infrastructure, as we saw in Albany. They identified a problem quickly.
As they cut more and more people out of the state workforce.
That's a challenge.
There are fewer and fewer people who are capable of doing dam inspection, who are around to do the approval of hydrofracking permits, to oversee the hydrofracking process, not to mention just the basic maintenance for roads and bridges that is supposed to be.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we've been talking about internally this week. We've been talking about with the commissioners that have been up here, Commissioner McDonald, as I said, was here today. Commissioner DeStito from OGS was here. And there's a concern about that because already we think that some of this stuff could be done more quickly. And if you're looking at workforce reductions, it's going to make that much more challenging. But we've got a lot on our plates here, and there's a lot of need here, but we've got to address this. We can't kick the can down the road any longer because it's going to be one more thing that undermines our economic recovery if this infrastructure keeps crumbling.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Mike Elmendorf. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Liz. Good to see you.
In such a lovely setting, too. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your conference.
It's been a great meeting. Thank you.